So last week we started talking about the how God can take the impossibilities in our lives, things that absolutely can't happen, and He can turn them and change them into possibilities. And we were looking at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I asked Riley, should I say Radshach, Meshach, and Abednego? It's funny. We're talking about the same things. But that God could take that and with their faith change something that there's no way they could have come out of that. But because of their strong faith, God was able to work in their lives. And I wanted to develop that story because there's a couple points in that story that are very, very significant to me. And they're very powerful. That these young men, the four of them, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the four of them had a strong, strong faith. And where that came from, and the significance of their situation. And so I want to continue that now. And what I want to look at now is the significance of where they went. When God allowed His nation, this is the nation of Judah. Remember, Israel, they've split. Israel has already been taken captive because of their disobedience and their sin to God. And now Judah has followed in the same steps of Israel, and they're being taken captive. And this is what God set up. And that he had told them over and over, if you don't follow me, this is what's going to happen. But the significance of who took them over is very powerful to me. And so that's where we're starting at first. At the very beginning, when His people came off the ark, God said, I want you to disperse. He says in Genesis 9:1, He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. He didn't want them all right there. He wanted them to scatter. He wanted them to go over all the earth. But they didn't. They stayed in this one spot. And here it says in Genesis 11:4, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. The city of Babylon was built with the beginning of the Tower of Babel. That's how the beginning of the city was. This began with people opposed to God. Instead of doing what God said to do, they said, no, we're going to do what we want to do, and we're going to make a name for ourselves. And I want to talk about who built Babel. In Genesis 10:8, it says, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it was said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria and built Nineveh and Rehoboth-ur, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. So this man Nimrod, he was a mighty man. Not only was he mighty, he was very powerful. He was a tyrant. He was the chief of these people. That word, when it says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, that word before has the idea of facing, of looking towards. And Nimrod was opposed to God. You can kind of think of it as he was looking face to face with God, opposing God, very defiant towards God. And he's the one who instigated the building of the Tower of Babel. And I want to read what Josephus wrote about Nimrod. Now the sons of Noah were three, Shem, Japheth, and Ham, born 100 years before the deluge. These first of all descended from the mountains into the plains and fixed their habitation there, and persuaded others who were greatly afraid of the lower grounds on account of the flood, and so were very loath to come down from the higher places to venture to follow their example. Now the plain in which they first dwelt was called Shinar. God also commanded them to send colonies abroad for the thorough peopling of the earth, that they might not raise seditions among themselves, but might cultivate a great part of the earth and enjoy its fruits after plentiful manner. But they were so ill instructed that they did not obey God, for which reason they fell into calamities, and were made sensible by experience of what sin they had been guilty. For when they flourished with a numerous youth, God admonished them again to send out colonies. But they, imagining the prosperity they enjoyed was not derived from the power of God, but supposing by their own power was the proper cause of the plentiful condition they were in, did not obey him. Nay, they added to their disobedience to the divine will the suspicion that they were therefore ordered to send out separate colonies, that being divided asunder they might the more easily be oppressed. Now, it was Nimrod who excited them to such an affront and contempt of God. He was the grandson of Ham, the son of Noah, a bold man, and of great strength in hand. He persuaded them not to ascribe to God, as if it was through his means they were happy, but to believe that it was their own courage which procured that happiness. He also gradually changed the government into tyranny, seeing no other way of turning men from the fear of God, but to bring them into a constant dependence on his power. He also said he would be revenged on God if he should have a mind to drown the whole world again, for that he would build a tower too high for the waters to reach, and that he would avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers. This is the mentality that the Tower of Babel was built on, and then subsequently the city of Babylon. This absolute defiance on God, that we're going to do it our way, and you won't be able to do anything about it. Nimrod, he put pitch all around the bottom of the Tower of Babel as to protect it from a flood. And I just think it's, you think about that. Sometimes we do that. We think, well, we'll protect this. And it's the kind of the ridiculousness of it, as if God couldn't overcome that. But the significance of how evil this city was, and it was built on evil, and it grew evil. This was a very corrupt city, built from the very beginning. And Nimrod was said to be one of the first dictators of the earth. And you can see these cities he built. Nineveh was a very worldly city and a very godless city. This was sort of his empire. This is what it was built on. And so I want us to just remember that, and later we'll come back and see the significance of that and how it applies to our life. So that's the history of Babylon, and that God says in Ezra, but because our fathers had angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried away the people to Babylonia. What I want us to understand is this didn't just happen. This was set up by God. God set up this very corrupt, worldly, completely godless empire, this city, this empire, to take over his people. And this is what these young men were experiencing. They were captives in this very corrupt city. This very corrupt city that the whole idea was built in defiance to God. So you can imagine the culture that is there. There's no God. There's no feeling of God in that culture, anywhere in that city. And yet, even through that, they held their faith. And there's another part of this story that I think is, so the city they went into is significant, but the other part of this story that I think is so powerful is the whole chapter 2 of Daniel. And it's just amazing that, like what Mike was teaching on today. So if you turn to Daniel, and I think it's a good exercise to find these Bibles, these books. Even if you have to sing the whole song. It's after Psalms and Proverbs. Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea. So turn to Daniel 2, and we'll So first we learned last week that these young men held their faith when the whole reason this story even happened, the whole reason they were even in the city of Babylon was because their leaders were corrupt. Everybody around them was corrupt. They were following the world. So that's the first part that they were in. The second part is that they were captives in a very evil city, and they knew that God had allowed that city to overtake them. And the third part of this story, the reason they're even standing before King Nebuchadnezzar, is the story in chapter 2. And I'm just going to summarize this as we go through it. But like Mike was saying, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. And he doesn't tell anybody what the dream is. But he says, I want you guys to tell me. I want you to interpret it. And he says in verse 2, the king commanded that the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. Remember last week when we talked about who the Chaldeans were? They were this group of people, this whole kind of nation that was in the lower part of the Mesopotamia area. But that also the Chaldeans became sort of a social class of people, where some of them were the thinkers, philosophers, and that's what makes sense in this context here. That when he summoned the Chaldeans, he didn't summon the whole fierce nation. He summoned this social class of people who were within the wise, the wise people. And so part of these Chaldeans are in this circle of people that is the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers. Well, they can't answer him. And it's the Chaldeans who go back to him and say, tell us your dream and we'll interpret it. And through this, the king comes back to him and says, you're just trying to buy time. I know you can't do this. And then he's furious with them because they can't. And the Chaldeans tell King Nebuchadnezzar in verse 11, the thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with the flesh. And they say before that, they say there's not a man on earth that could meet the king's demand. And King Nebuchadnezzar's reaction is, it's always the same. He's furious. And so he says everybody's dead because the Chaldeans cannot do their job. They could not come through. Everybody's dead. All the wise men now in the kingdom there's a decree sent out saying you're all dead. Well, Daniel and his companions were wise men. So they were in that whole sweep of people that were going to be killed. And so Daniel, this is so powerful. It says in verse 14, Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. Daniel, a man of God, answered this. He did nothing wrong. Him and his companions did nothing wrong. This was the fault of the Chaldeans, who couldn't do their job. But Daniel answers in discretion. He says, let me talk to the king. And then what does he do? He goes back to his companions and he prays. He held tight to God. Even though everything around him was chaotic and he's about to die because of somebody else's problem, he takes it to God. And the story goes that God shows him the interpretation. He goes back to the king. And then what does the king do? He says in verse 47, the king answered and said to Daniel, truly your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. King Nebuchadnezzar goes from furious to now saying, your God is the God of gods. And so because of this now, and their lives aren't on the chopping block, but they're lifted to high positions. We know that Daniel, it says he was put in high honors and given many gifts and made ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And then he asked, can I put my companions in a place of authority? And so he placed them over the affairs of the provinces. So now these three men are rulers over the province. And Daniel himself is a ruler in the king's court. So here these four captives, they're foreigners, and they were captives, they were slaves. Yes, Paul?
As far as their age, can we assume that they're probably early 20s because weren't they teenagers when they went into captivity?
That's kind of what I always figured. Paul was asking the age of the boys, and I they were young men. They were somewhere in that range. But the wisdom that they had, even in the midst of all evil, it was evil and corruption all around them. And now they're set as foreigners in this corrupt place as rulers, these young men, foreigners. And what do the Chaldeans do? They don't like it. The Chaldeans somehow, it doesn't say what their feelings were, but it says that Nebuchadnezzar, right after he tells Daniel, your God is the God of gods, what does he do? Goes and sets up himself as God and says, okay, everybody bow down to me. And then the Chaldeans, it says, now we're in chapter 3, and it says in verse 8, therefore at that time certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. And I want you just to get a grasp of this situation. These Jews just saved their lives. These Jews and their God saved these Chaldeans' lives. They wouldn't be alive if they hadn't have went and talked to their God. But they came back and are maliciously accusing these young men of something. And they knew what those young men would do. They knew they would not bow down to Nebuchadnezzar. They knew that they would be punished. And so and then we know what went on from there, is that they held their faith. They held their faith through that accusation, and they said, we don't care what happens to us. We're going to hold our faith, and we're going to hold it strong. And so that's the whole background. And now I want to spend some time in going and seeing how does that apply to our lives, and what can we learn from these young men? Now I find what slide I'm on here. Okay, that's I missed that. I just talked about that slide. Skip that slide. I got to get mine here. Okay, so this summary here, I want us to look and see that, remember how we talked about in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, how it talked about these nations were following the world. And I want us to understand that when everybody around us is following the world, when we know that something is wrong, you know that these young men had to have heard Jeremiah's teaching. They had to have heard the prophets, and they had to have seen their leaders choosing the false way. And here they are being taken captive because the people around them were making very poor decisions. And that's very powerful. It's powerful for me, at least. When I read this story, I can kind of just, oh, that was them. But if I put that into my own life, in my own context, and to think, how would I feel if I knew the corruption around me was going to hurt me, and yet I could see them and they would not listen and they wouldn't change? These people who should know better, they should be choosing the right way. They know it, but they will not change. This is where they were. And it didn't change these young men's faith. I keep wanting to call them boys. It didn't change their faith. That is so, so powerful. That even though corruption was in their nation, and they knew that they knew what Jeremiah was prophesying, they knew what was going to happen to them, they held on to God through it and weren't discouraged because of the people around them. And it says there in what I have up here is just how corrupt these nations were, that they were following the Baals. They weren't just not listening to God. They were wholeheartedly following the world around them. And I want us to take a look at our lives and think, are we doing that? Are we just following people around us because that's what everybody is doing? Maybe the whole church is doing something, and that's just what everybody's doing. But is it what God wants? Is it what the will of God is? And that goes back to truly knowing who God is, and not knowing it based on what your friends or your neighbors or somebody sitting next to you in the chair at church next to you is doing, but truly holding on to God despite what is going on around you. That's the faith that these boys had, to hold on to God through that corruption. And the second thing that's so powerful to me, I keep going back to this in this story, but that God allowed this situation to happen that brought punishment to his faithful servants. He didn't protect them from this. The whole nation was taken. The whole nation was destroyed and taken captive. And he didn't protect, the ones who held close to him. He didn't seclude them off and not allow them to be punished. They had to be punished along with everybody else. They were taken captives. And the part I want us to understand from this is that we can hold our faith strong even though we are part of a punishment or a discipline. That may not even be ours, because this was absolutely not these 4 young men's. It's nothing that they're doing. It was their leaders and everybody around them. But they had to go through that. They were... Go ahead, Carol.
Well, I was just thinking about, how this is such a perfect example of God bringing all things together for good. I mean, they continued to be faithful through a very, very difficult time, and they rose up to be an example, even to us today.
Yeah.
It's a pretty amazing story, and it's a great example of bringing everything together for good.
So Carol was saying this is a great example of God working for the good, in the big picture, the good, and that they rose up and had a mighty story that's still an example for us today. And we talked last week about sunny skies. That a lot of times we can see God working in that, but we can't in the storms. And that's kind of the point I want us to see through this, is that they held fast to God through all this evil. It wasn't because their lives were good. They were marched along with everybody else as slaves, as captives into this city of Babylon, and they were put in a higher position as wise men. But through all of that, God was with them. And this is what I keep telling myself, and I want us to understand that God doesn't stop those things from happening. He's with us in them. He was with them as they were marched into Babylon. He didn't prevent it from happening. And he was with them as they held their faith among the godless people. He didn't make those people change around them, but he was with those young men as they had to go through this. And then, when they're in there, they were maliciously accused, wrongly accused. And I keep thinking, man, how could we handle this? Can you imagine somebody who you've helped out and you've basically saved them? You've saved their lives. You've gone above and you've helped them, and for them to turn around and do something malicious to you. And this was what happened to these 4 young men, and it was to the point where their lives were at stake for it. And even then they didn't lose their faith. Even then they didn't cry out to God and say, why? How could you allow this and all of that? None of that. They just held to God. And that is so powerful, that sometimes we can get caught up in the drama of life and the hurts and the pains of just relationships and all of that. And sometimes we can get down in that and want to be in that. But these boys didn't. They rose above that, and they said, we don't care what happens, and we don't care what you say about us and what will happen because of your actions. We are holding on to God. Through all of that, they never turned to any other god, whether it was the God of their nations or the God of, you could even say the God of self, turning to self-pity or their own desires. They did none of that. They always went to God. And I think that is so powerful for us when we're accused or something happens in relationships, that we can go to God and we can hold our faith, not because the world is perfect around us, not because the people around us are perfect and making our lives beautiful, but because of who God is. And that's why we hold on to him. These young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's very interesting. They always call him by Daniel, his Hebrew name, and they call the others by their Babylonian name. You know, they never call Daniel by his Babylonian name, Belteshazzar. But he was given that name when he first went in as a captive. But no matter what they went through, they were committed to never bow down to other gods. They were committed to that when everybody around them was doing wrong. They looked to God's word. And I think that's such a powerful lesson to always go back to God. Not what my friends are doing, not what, family's doing, not whatever, but what does God want me to do? And truly knowing God and his will. They wouldn't bow down when they weren't exempt. Maybe they could have grown very bitter with God and said, God, you're not saving us. We've served you all this time, and you're going to let us get taken captives? They had none of that bitterness. They held to God through that. Their faith didn't waver as they were taken as slaves. We know when they went in and they were told, you need to eat the king's food, they wouldn't do it. Their faith never, ever wavered, no matter what was around them. And then when they had saved other people's lives and those people came back and accused them, still never made them waver. And I think, man, if I had went through just a portion of that, would my faith have wavered? Would have I had some bitterness? Would have I had some questions? And why? But they didn't. And that's such a powerful lesson that they knew who God was. And it wasn't because they knew what God could do for them. It wasn't because they served God because he was blessing their lives in every way and making all their paths perfect. They served him because they knew who their God was and they wanted to serve him. Through all of this, God made them face the difficulties and he made them walk through it. He didn't take any of that away. He made them walk in a society that was serving Baals. This is the nation of Judah. This is their own people were going after all these other gods. And he made them walk in that society. He made them live with those people. He didn't isolate them. He made them stay in that and walk through that. He made them walk through as captives. Again, he didn't protect them and say, you guys aren't going to be punished with everybody else. He made them walk as captives into that city. And I say walk, I don't know how they got there, but they had to go through that process. They had to go through that process of being captives. They had to go through the process of being accused. God didn't protect them from that. And they had to physically walk into the fire. And I tell you, every time I build a fire, and last year when we had that big bonfire, it just terrifies me, the thought that you get that close. And I always wonder, could I do that? Could I walk into that fire? And that was a hot fire. God didn't protect them from it. He didn't change King Nebuchadnezzar's mind. He didn't do any of that. He said, you walk into it. And through all of this, when he made them walk with his people that were corrupt, when he made them walk in as captives, when he made them walk through the process of being accused, in all of that, he protected them. And he made them step into that fire, and he protected them. And that is such a powerful lesson for us, is that God doesn't take these things away. He doesn't take the storms away. He makes us walk through them, whatever they are. And it's by our faith, by turning to him, that we can then see him work in the lives. And that's the finality of this story with these young men, is that when they, by faith, they stepped out and said, we're going to do what's right, then God was able to work. And like Carol said, that's where we see God shine and God turning these situations. And everybody there knew who did it because of their faith and being willing to step out. And so I want to encourage us through this story to not base our faith on our surroundings and not base our faith on what others are doing, but base our faith on who God is and what he can get us through, and know that as we step out into those things that are terrifying, I don't know how terrifying it was for those guys to step into that fire, but it had to have been something that God's going to ask us to do the same thing and to be reassured that he's there with us. And like those young men said, it doesn't matter what happens. We may live or we may die, but we're not going to turn against God. And I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks.